Hello, AP Euro students. So I promised you guys that we would be reading some World War I poetry, and I prepared an analysis for us. We're going to read Dulce, Decorum Est. What I would like for you guys to do is to go to the website, to the Chapter 25 tab, and scroll down, get to the Chapter 25 reading packet, and click on this. It's a PDF file, and you'll find something like this. And then just scroll down to number 2. It is Dulce Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen. So I've prepared it here, though, if you want to also just follow along. And I want to tell you a little bit about this poem because it's a really famous work of literature from World War I by a British soldier named Wilfred Owen. So first of all, World War I, a lot of men enlisted or were drafted, and this included men from all walks of life in Britain, well, in every country that participated, really. But this includes artists and writers, teachers, academics, intellectuals, celebrities, you name it. And Wilfred Owen was actually a soldier who he ends up actually enlisting when he's in his early 20s. And he is made second lieutenant in the Manchester Regiment. So he enlisted in 1915, roughly less than a year after the war broke out. He was a poet as well and as a writer. And when he's kind of not, he's not an aristocrat, but he's somewhat from the upper class-ish, upper middle class, I could say. And when he first enlists in the war, he initially thinks his troops are what they called loudish, meaning that they seemed aggressive, sort of apathetic, kind of just in general, just his soldiers had bad attitudes. And he complained about that. And then after being in the war for a while, he realized why they were this way. If you've seen the movie 1917, which I talked about, you'll notice this too in a lot of the troops. Many of them just sort of seem not to care about anything. This really has to do with the fact that the war itself, after a while, starts to seem, not just the war, but the death, seemed pointless. Many soldiers were disillusioned. They became disappointed in the war itself. Remember, this feeling of nationalism and patriotism and celebration at the early stage of the war quickly disappears when they realize how many soldiers could die so quickly, so meaninglessly for nothing in this war at the hands of these aggressive industrial weapons like the machine gun. So a lot of soldiers just developed overall negative attitudes, and you can't really blame them for that. He ends up getting injured, and when he's injured, he goes to Edinburgh in Scotland to recuperate, and at the hospital, he actually becomes friends with another poet named Siegfried Sassoon, who one of his poems is also in your reading packet. And they become quick friends, and he falls under the influence of Siegfried Sassoon, and they end up actually teaching together for a little while at a very poor high school up in Scotland. And then he is then called back to war, and he goes to France, where much of the war, of course, is taking place. And he ends up getting killed in battle on November 4th, 1918. This is exactly 1 week before the armistice. So it was really terrible. At the age of 25, he died exactly 1 week before the war itself came to an end. This is him, by the way, Wilfred Owen, who wrote the poem we're about to read. He wrote it possibly in a trench, possibly in the hospital. I'm not exactly sure when he wrote it, but he titles it Dulce et Decorum Est. So this is a Latin phrase, you could probably tell. It comes from the Roman poet Horace. Horace was a poet in ancient Rome. He wrote many poems about history as well. And he has this poem called Ode 3.2, which is about valor or bravery and courage. And the phrase literally translates to, it is sweet and honorable. The whole phrase is Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, which literally translates to, it is sweet and honorable to die for one's country. Now, when he writes this, though, I want you guys to pay close attention to Owen's tone in the poem when he actually uses this line. He didn't live long enough to see it published. It was published after he died in 1920. And it is considered to be one of World War I's most famous works of literary art. There's a lot of downtime in the trenches. Soldiers had a lot of time to write, and many of those writings were published, whether through letters or journals, poems and stories. But this poem is special because it expresses so poignantly the horrors of trench warfare, the meaninglessness of the loss of life, the trauma that soldiers experience that didn't quite have a name yet, and the brutality and the gore of the war itself. So, as you read it, I want you guys to consider his tone. Like, how does he exactly use the line, Dulce decorum est pro patria mori? Would you say that this is a patriotic poem? Do you think it depicts war in a courageous and brave light? So I want you to maybe compare it to The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson, which we read about the Crimean War. Okay, so let's begin. The first stanza, it's two sonnets put together, although it's irregular if you study poetry at all. It starts like this. Bent double, like beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. So this first stanza is describing soldiers actually leaving the trench after a battle. So these would be surviving soldiers. And he describes how they move, how they walk. When he says that they are bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, meaning that they're walking away, hurt, injured, exhausted. As you can imagine, they look like beggars. When he says knock-kneed, it means that many of them, their legs are trembling. They're coughing, of course, and, in a bad mood, but they're cursing through the sludge, the mud of the battlefield. And as they're walking away, he says, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs. So this means that as they're walking away, you should imagine behind them fire of some sort, haunting flares. The sky is probably red and orange with fire from artillery. And they're trudging towards their distant rest. Many of them, after a couple weeks of being in a week of being in the frontline trench, they go back for rest, and then they get called back to the frontline trench again, which was, as you can imagine, pretty traumatic and shocking. To go from being put in a place like a frontline trench and then resume back to normalcy and then go back to the frontline trench, it would be like a shock to your system. And he says, men march asleep, of course, because they're exhausted. It's interesting that many lose their boots. Why do so many of them lose their boots? Many of them would actually lose them on purpose because the trenches were so wet and muddy that their boots would actually be ruined. But he then says, he describes them as they're limping on, bloodshot, of course, because they're injured. But he notes all went lame and all blind, meaning that they don't even really see anymore. Many of them might have been blind due to injury. They can't walk well anymore because they are drunk with exhaustion. And this line, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. They've become so accustomed to the noise of the war, the sound of shells falling, the sound of bombs going off, that they don't even hear them anymore. So this line denotes a sort of numbness that soldiers developed to everything about the war and being in the combat. They had become so used to it that they were now numb to it. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. So he describes this instance where, as they're walking away towards their distant rest, someone yells out, gas, gas, gas. That was the sign that a mustard gas canister was going off. And when that happens, you have to quickly get your gas mask on, or you'll be blinded or choked to death on the gas. So he describes how everybody just clumsily fits theirs in just in time, except for one. One man doesn't manage to get his gas mask on in time. And so he describes this man as floundering like a man in fire or lime. When he says, dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. What he means by that is he, the writer, manages to get his gas mask on. And the gas mask goggles were, once you had them on, everything looked green because they were like these sort of thick green tinted panes or glass that would be used to make the goggles. So when you're looking out through a gas mask, everything looks sort of greenish. So he says, I see him through this sort of greenish light. I see him drowning as in like choking in the gas. As he sees him dying because he doesn't get his mask on in time. And this next line connects these sonnets. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. These two lines stand alone in the poem. This is probably one of the more important lines or parts of the poem because he's talking about the post-traumatic stress that he exhibits, that he experiences afterwards. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Wilfred Owen is basically saying that every night when he goes to sleep, this is one of the things he sees when he closes his eyes. He sees this man guttering, choking, and drowning, and reaching out to him, plunging at me. Many soldiers were so traumatized they couldn't sleep. Many of them trembled for a long time. The photograph you see on this slide shows soldiers who have all been victims of a gas attack. They've all been blinded by it. Most of the blindness was temporary, although it would create lasting and permanent damage. But this was how soldiers would actually have to walk away from the field. One man would lead them, each man, and they would walk in a line, each of them with a hand on the shoulder of the man in front of them, and they would lead each other off the battlefield. When many men returned home, this is how they arrived, walking. So this is what you would see, for example, in your hometown, when all the men who survived the war came home, you would see them blinded, walking like this in a sort of very morbid parade. The last part. Now here, pay close attention to his tone. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. So maybe this poem takes an unexpected turn from how you were expecting him to use this Latin phrase. After he is finished describing what the soldiers walking back from this horrible scene and the trauma of seeing one of his brothers in arms choke on mustard gas, he now speaks to you, the reader. And he says, if you could see what I saw, if you had the same nightmares that I have, where you are walking behind the wagon that we flung him in. So notice he uses the word flung rather than place, denoting how soldiers' bodies are treated. There's so much death and destruction that you lose humanity itself. Soldiers' bodies are literally flung into wagons. And he describes how he's walking behind the wagon that the soldier has been flung in, but he's still alive. He says, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face. So he's watching this man, he's walking behind this wagon and watching this man die, this horrific, tortured death. And he's walking behind him like it's this most normal thing, being forced to simply just watch and walk behind the wagon. And he describes his face a hanging face like a devil's, sick of sin. Like even the devil himself has gotten sick of this. If you could hear at every jolt, so every time the wagon jolts, the blood comes gargling out of his lungs. And you can imagine what that looks like, I guess, on his face. He's basically saying, if you could see what I saw, you wouldn't go around telling people with all this enthusiasm, in particular children, ardent for some desperate glory. He refers to them as children. Many of the soldiers who died in the war were teenagers. Many of them had enlisted because they thought they were burning with desire for the glory of war itself, desperate glory. And here he really uses this as, if you could see what I saw, you wouldn't go around telling these kids who want some glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. In other words, Wilfred Owen says it's not true. It is not true that, to die for your country is sweet and honorable. Why might he say this? You got to take into account his experience. Now, a lot of people might disagree and say, no, to die for your country is sweet and honorable. But Wilfred Owen, who is doing it right there and he's living that experience, he says this is a lie. And he sounds very bitter, very angry about this. So I want you guys to think about the experience of World War I and trench warfare. And tell me, what do you think? How would you compare this to the charge of the Light Brigade? Because both poems describe the sacrifice of men in war, but they do so rather differently. So post in the comments below why this poem might be different and why Wilfred Owen says that this is a lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So go ahead and post it in your Google Classroom, and I'm going to be posting now. My next video will be on the Russian Revolution, and then after that on the end of the war. And I also want you guys to go into your reading packet, and if you want to compare Wilfred Owen to other literary greats of World War I, you can also read, where is it? It's number 15. They by Siegfried Sassoon, who was actually a mentor to Wilfred Owen, and Dead Man's Dump by Isaac Rosenberg. These are also both poems and stories written by World War I soldiers from their own experiences. Another thing that you could read as well that I highly recommend, since we are going to need to practice some of these primary source analyses, is number 1 and 3. Number 1 is a report from the front, from the Western Front, the Battle for Verdun in 1916. This was a horrific and bloody battle in which thousands of soldiers died, again, for very little gain. On the other side, though, number 3 is The Home Front by Evelyn Blucher. This is actually a woman writing her own account of what it's like to be at home, waiting for a report from the war, dealing with the shortages of food and resources at home. And interestingly, this is a German woman. So this gives you an idea of how German people who were not on the front lines, but actually civilians at home, how they experienced the war as well. With that being said, guys, I'm going to leave you with that. We're going to talk about these later. I'll have some Zoom sessions later once we get back from spring break. And we'll continue talking about some of these analyses and also what to expect for the AP exam now that we know it's a modified DBQ, and what it means for us now that we're trying to finish up the curriculum. All right, I'll see you guys later. Don't forget to comment in the sections below.